There is a sound that exists only in the space between heartbeats. It is not a sound that can be heard with the ears, but with the memory. It is the echo of footsteps on ancient stone, the whisper of silk that has been dust for 5 centuries, the faint, metallic click of a locket clasp opening in a chamber where no one breathes. Listen! It is the 19th of May in the year 1536. The hour is just before dawn. The place is the Tower of London, a fortress of grey stone and older shadows. The air is cold. It carries the scent of the River Thames, of damp earth, and of something else, a tension so thick it seems to have weight. Within the walls of the tower, a woman kneels. She has prayed through the night. Her candles have burned down to pools of wax. Her eyes, dark and luminous, are fixed on a small altar, but she does not see it. She is seeing something else. Her childhood, the French court where she learned to laugh, the king's eyes, once warm, now cold as the stone that surrounds her. Her name is Anne Boleyn. She has been Queen of England. In a few hours she will walk to a scaffold draped in black. She will face a swordsman brought from Calais, because the king, in a gesture that passes for mercy, has decreed she shall not feel the axe. She will make a short speech, her voice steady in the morning air. She will remove her headdress, tuck her hair beneath a simple coif, and kneel in the straw. And then a flash of steel, a sound like a sigh, and the Queen of England will become a ghost. But this is not merely a story of a death. It is a story of how a woman becomes a legend, how history, memory, and myth intertwine until the truth is as elusive as smoke. Was she a witch who enchanted a king, a martyr for the reformed faith, a victim of a tyrant's whim, or simply a woman who loved, hoped, and paid the ultimate price for failing to give a king a son? The answers are buried in the cold ground of the Tower's Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, buried with her bones, and yet she has not rested. They say her spirit walks. They say her ghost haunts the places of her joy and her despair. But perhaps the truest haunting is not of stone and shadow. It is of the question she left behind. What do we do with a woman who refused to be forgotten? We begin not at the end, but at the beginning, in the cool light of a French chateau where a clever girl first learned the power of a glance. So draw close to the fire, let the wind rattle the panes, let the shadows gather in the corners, and keep the candle lit. The wind moves differently through the Weald of Kent. It is softer here, carrying the scent of apples from the orchards, of hay from the fields, of the slow, deep breath of the English countryside. In the midst of this gentle landscape stands Hever Castle, a double-moated manor of golden stone, not yet the great fortress it would become, but a home, a place of family. It is the year 1513 or thereabouts. History does not mark the precise moment a soul awakens to its own power. But here, in the cool shadows of Hever's halls, a girl is growing. Her name is Anne. She is the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a diplomat of modest rank but considerable ambition, and his wife, Elizabeth Howard, whose blood runs with the blue of the old nobility. Anne is not the prettiest of the Boleyn children. That distinction belongs to her sister Mary, with her fair hair and easy laugh. Anne is different. She has her mother's dark complexion, her father's sharp intelligence, and eyes that seem to hold more than they reveal. They are eyes that watch, that calculate, that remember. The world she knows is small. The clang of the kitchen, the murmur of prayer in the small family chapel, the rustle of her mother's skirts on the stone stairs. But beyond the moat, beyond the Weald, a larger world is calling. Her father has plans for his daughters, plans that involve the most glittering courts in Europe. The first transition comes on the wind from the Channel. It carries Anne, barely into her teenage years, across the sea to the court of the Netherlands, and then to France. It is there, in the orbit of the brilliant and controversial Queen Claude, that the English girl is remade. The French court is a symphony of silk and wit. It is a place where ideas are as important as lineage, where poetry is recited in galleries hung with tapestries, where the latest fashions from Italy are debated with the same fervor as matters of state. Anne drinks it all in. She learns to dance with a grace that seems effortless. She learns to converse with princes and scholars, her tongue sharpened on the whetstone of French wit. She learns the power of a well-timed glance, the weight of a word left unspoken. French polish gives her a patina that no English girl could possess. She returns to England in 1522, a young woman of about 21. She is not conventionally beautiful, not in the rosy, golden-haired English style, but she possesses something far more dangerous, allure, a magnetism that draws the eye and holds it. She steps into the court of Henry VII, a place of gilded cages and hungry wolves, and she does not know yet that she has stepped into her own fate. The court of Henry VII at Whitehall is a thing of terrible beauty. It is a maze of galleries and chambers, of presence chambers where courtiers kneel and privy chambers where secrets are born. The air is thick with incense and ambition. The king himself is a golden giant, 6 feet and 2 inches of charisma and ego, his hair auburn, his clothes sewn with jewels, his mind as quick as his temper. Into this world walks Anne. She is appointed as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. The Queen is a decade older than the king, her beauty faded by years of childbearing and loss. She is pious, serious, the daughter of Spanish monarchs. She is also, in the eyes of many, the king's true wife, a marriage that has lasted 2 decades. Anne watches. She learns the hierarchy, the unspoken rules, the subtle cruelties. She sees the king's eye, restless and predatory, scan the young women of the court. He has already had an affair with her sister Mary. Mary is now a discarded mistress, married off quietly, her brief moment in the sun over. Anne vows silently that she will not be another Mary. She will not be a conquest. She will be a prize. And the man who wants her will have to pay a price no king has ever paid. The wonder of possibility hangs in the air like incense. The game is about to begin. The first letter arrives probably in 1527, though the exact date is lost to the dust of archives. It is written in the king's own hand, a fact of staggering significance. Henry VII, the Lord's anointed, the most powerful man in England, does not write letters. He dictates them. But for Anne Boleyn, he takes up a pen. The words are fervent. They are filled with the language of courtly love, of knights and distant ladies, of a suffering heart that can find no rest. He signs them with a curious symbol, a heart enclosed in a lover's knot. Anne reads them in her chambers, the candlelight flickering on the royal seal. She knows the game. She knows that to yield is to be forgotten. And so she writes back, but she does not yield. She holds him at a distance, a sun that warms but does not burn. For a man like Henry, accustomed to having his every whim satisfied, this is a new and intoxicating torment. He becomes obsessed. The letters grow longer, more desperate. He promises her the world. She asks for his heart. He offers it. She asks for more. The king's desire for Anne Boleyn collides with the conscience of Christendom. He is married to Catherine. She has failed to give him a son, the one thing a Tudor king requires. Henry, a man of genuine if selective piety, begins to believe that his marriage is cursed. He finds a verse in Leviticus: "If a man shall take his brother's wife, they shall be childless." Catherine was briefly married to his dead brother, Arthur. It is the loophole he needs. He sends Cardinal Wolsey, his great minister, to Rome to plead for an annulment from the Pope. But the Pope is a prisoner, in effect, of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He cannot grant the king's request. The years drag on. The courts of Europe buzz with scandal, and Anne waits. She is blamed by the people. They call her the king's whore. They hiss as she passes. At court her enemies multiply, but she holds her ground. She knows that if she wavers, if she becomes his mistress, she is lost. She must be his wife, or she will be nothing. The tension breaks, not with a solution, but with a fall. Cardinal Wolsey, unable to deliver the annulment, is stripped of his power and his wealth. He dies on his way to London, broken and afraid. Anne is blamed for his fall too. The whispers grow louder. They say she is a witch, that she has enchanted the king. But a new mind is rising in the king's service. Thomas Cromwell. He is a man of cold, calculating genius. He sees a way forward that does not rely on the Pope. If Rome will not grant the king his divorce, then England will simply leave Rome. The Reformation Parliament is called. The Church of England is born. In secret, in January of 1533, Henry marries Anne. She is already pregnant. The child, they are certain, is the long-awaited son. In the spring, she is crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of breathtaking splendor. She processes through the streets of London in a litter of white satin, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, a crown of gold on her head. The crowds are silent. They do not cheer. They watch in cold judgment. But Anne does not see them. She is looking ahead. She is carrying the future King of England. And in that moment, she believes, truly believes, that she has won. The coronation pageantry was magnificent. The barges on the Thames, the fountains running with wine, the cloth of gold that draped the streets. But beneath the spectacle lay a profound unease. The people of London, ever loyal to the good Queen Catherine, did not take this new queen to their hearts. They saw her as the interloper, the homewrecker, the witch. Anne, gliding through the silent crowds in her litter, must have felt the weight of their stares. A queen should hear cheers. She heard only the shuffle of feet, the murmur of a few forced acclamations. It was a cold omen, a chill wind on a summer's day. But she had the king. She had the child in her belly. She had won. She took up residence at Greenwich Palace, her favorite, a place of light and air overlooking the river. Her rooms were hung with her emblem, the falcon crowned, perched on a tree stump from which roses sprang. It was a symbol of hope, of new life blooming from the old. She waited. The waiting ended in the afternoon of September 7th, 1533. The pains came, and Anne retreated to her chambers, surrounded by her ladies, by physicians, by the rituals of childbirth that had claimed so many women before her. The court held its breath. A child was born, a girl. The news was brought to the king. Henry, who had been so certain of a son, who had already planned the tournaments to celebrate his heir, received the news in silence. Then he left. He did not visit Anne. He did not hold the child. The disappointment was a physical blow, a wound that would never fully heal. Anne, in her exhaustion, asked for the baby. They placed the small, mewling creature in her arms. She was perfect. Tiny fingers, dark eyes like her own. Anne named her Elizabeth after her mother and her grandmother. She held her close, the love immediate and absolute. But in the shadows of the room, a thought lingered, cold as the river mist. She had failed in her first, most sacred duty. She had not given the king a son. The descent from that moment was gradual at first, almost imperceptible. The king was still attentive. He visited. He seemed to accept the child, ordering a magnificent christening. But something had shifted. The fervor, the obsession had cooled. Anne, sharp-witted and proud, felt it. She tried to rekindle the flame. She danced for him. She argued with him, hoping to spark the old passion. But he had seen her fail. In his eyes, she was no longer the unattainable prize. She was the woman who had promised a son and delivered a daughter. The pressure to produce a male heir became the central fact of her existence. Every month that passed without conception was a month of dread. Every glance the king cast at another woman was a knife. She became pregnant again, quickly. But the stress, the fear, the constant political warfare at court took its toll. In the summer of 1534, she miscarried. The king's reaction was cold. He spoke of witchcraft, of divine displeasure. Anne, desperate, blamed her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, for shocking her with news of the king's infidelity. The arguments became public, vicious. The golden cage was turning to iron. The year 1535 bled into 1536. Anne was queen, but her throne was built on sand. The king's eye, restless and hungry, had found a new focus. Her name was Jane Seymour. She was in every way Anne's opposite. Where Anne was dark and witty, Jane was pale and demure. Where Anne spoke, Jane listened. Where Anne challenged, Jane acquiesced. It is a bitter truth, known to all who have loved and lost. The replacement is often the inversion of the original. Jane was everything Anne was not. She was safe. She was quiet. She would not argue. She would, Henry believed, give him a son. Anne watched. She saw the king's glances at mass. She saw the small favors, the gifts. She confronted him, her tongue sharp with fear and fury. The arguments were terrible. Henry, once so captivated by her spirit, now found it unbearable. He told her to shut her eyes and endure, as her betters had done. The words were a lash. In January of 1536, Anne learned she was pregnant again. It was a flicker of hope in the gathering darkness. Perhaps this time it would be a son. Perhaps this time she could win back the king's love, or at least his respect. She tried to be cautious. She tried to be calm. But the court was a viper's nest, and she was surrounded by enemies. On the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, the news came. The king burst into Anne's rooms, dressed entirely in yellow, a color of mourning in some traditions, of celebration in others. He held their daughter, Elizabeth, in his arms, and he seemed happy. Anne, pregnant, hopeful, must have allowed herself to believe that the worst was over. Then the blow fell. A few days later, the king was thrown from his horse during a joust. He was unconscious for 2 hours. The court was thrown into panic. Anne, terrified for the man she had once loved, miscarried. The child was a boy. It was, she later said, her last hope. She blamed the Duke of Norfolk for bringing her news of the king's fall. The king blamed her for bewitching him into his accident. There was no room for grief, only accusation. In the weeks after the miscarriage, Anne's world shrank. The king avoided her. He spent his time with Jane Seymour, dining with her, giving her gifts, parading her before the court. Anne, from her chambers, could hear the whispers. The crows were gathering. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, now saw her as an obstacle to his own power and to his vision of a Protestant England. He needed her gone. He began, in the cold, methodical way of his, to build a case. He collected rumors. He interrogated servants. He listened to the poisonous whispers of those who had always hated her. He was not looking for the truth. He was looking for a weapon. The court became a labyrinth of shadows. Every smile hid a knife. Every whispered confidence was a potential betrayal. Anne, isolated and afraid, could only wait. She did not know that the net was already tightening around her. She did not know that her brother, her friends, her very life, were about to be offered up as sacrifices to the king's desire for a new wife and a new start. The falling star was about to hit the ground. The accusations, when they came, were so monstrous that even now, nearly 5 centuries later, they defy belief. Anne was charged with adultery, not with one man but with 5. She was accused of seducing a court musician named Mark Smeaton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber Henry Norris, a young courtier Francis Weston, William Brereton, and most horrifying of all, her own brother George Boleyn. The charge of incest was the final, unthinkable stroke. It was designed to destroy not just Anne, but her entire family. It was a stain that could never be washed clean. The evidence, a few careless words, a glance held a moment too long, a gift given in friendship, and the confession of Mark Smeaton, the musician. He was the only one who confessed. It is said he was tortured. It is said the promise of a quick death loosened his tongue. He gave Cromwell what he needed, a thread from which to weave a rope. May Day 1536. The air at Greenwich should have been filled with the joy of the tournament. The king sat in his royal box. Anne sat nearby, her face a mask of composure. The jousting began. At one point the king was handed a note. He read it. His face changed. He rose without a word to Anne, mounted his horse and rode away. He never looked back. He rode for Whitehall with Henry Norris, one of the accused, by his side. It was the last time Anne saw her husband as a free woman. The next day she was arrested. She was taken by barge along the river, the same route she had taken to her coronation just 3 years before. But this time, the barges were not draped in cloth of gold. This time, she passed through Traitor's Gate, the water gate of the Tower of London, through which so many had entered and so few had left. As she stepped onto the cold stone, she fell to her knees. "Good friends," she is said to have cried, "I am come hither to die." She laughed, a sound of pure hysteria, before being led to her rooms. She was in the same building where she had stayed before her coronation. The irony was a cruelty the universe seemed to relish. The rooms in the tower were not a dungeon. They were comfortable by the standards of the day. She had 4 ladies to attend her, but they were her jailers too, reporting her every word, her every tear, back to Cromwell. The walls were thick. The windows were small. The world outside had ceased to exist. One by one, the men were tried and condemned. George Boleyn, her brother, conducted himself with wit and courage, but it was useless. The verdict was foretold. They were beheaded on Tower Hill, their heads held up to the crowd with the cry, "So perish all the king's enemies." Anne from her window could not see the executions, but she could hear the roar of the crowd, the dull thud of the axe. She waited. She prayed. She wrote a poem or a letter to the king protesting her innocence. It is a document of heartbreaking dignity. Whether he ever read it, we do not know. Probably not. The walls were closing in, and at the center of the darkness, Anne Boleyn began to prepare her soul. The twilight of Anne Boleyn's life lasted just over 2 weeks. From her arrest on May 2nd to her execution on May 19th, she existed in a liminal space, suspended between the queen she had been and the ghost she was about to become. The days were long, the nights were longer. She was allowed some small comforts. She received the sacrament. She talked with her ladies, her jailers. She asked one of them, Mistress Coffin, to find a fool who could make her laugh. A small request, a human request, from a woman facing annihilation. It was denied. Her mood shifted. At times she was composed, almost serene, accepting her fate with a dignity that would become legendary. At other times the terror broke through. She laughed, a high, brittle sound, and said that she heard the king called her Nan Bullen now, not his queen. She wept. She prayed. She held on to her faith, a reformed faith that promised salvation through grace alone, not through works. It was her only comfort. On the green before the tower, a scaffold was built. It was not the traditional block with its blunt axe. The king, in a gesture that he likely saw as great mercy, had sent to Calais for a swordsman, a headsman who used a blade so sharp, so swift, that death would be instantaneous. It was a professional courtesy, a final acknowledgement that she had, after all, been his wife and his queen. The news of the swordsman must have reached Anne. Did it bring her comfort, or did it simply make the end more real, more imminent? She asked for the sacrament one last time. She swore, on the holy wafer, on the body of Christ, that she was innocent of all the charges. It was an oath she took to her grave. The night of May 18th, the last candle burned low in Anne's chamber. She had said her goodbyes to her ladies. She had written her final words. The dawn would come, and with it, the end. There is a story told for centuries that as she prayed, a woman came to her, a woman she did not know. This woman told her that she would not die, that the king would relent, that a pardon was on its way. Anne, desperate to believe, listened, but the woman was a lie, a cruel trick sent, perhaps, to raise her hopes only to dash them. No pardon came. She slept, if she slept at all, and when the first grey light of dawn touched the stones of the tower, she rose. She put on a simple gown of grey damask, not the royal finery she had worn to her coronation. She covered her dark hair with a plain white coif. She was ready. The twilight was over. The dawn had come. The trial had taken place a few days earlier in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. It was a spectacle of injustice. 26 peers of the realm, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat in judgment. The King's Solicitor General read the charges, a litany of filth and fantasy. Anne listened. She stood before them, a queen in name only. When it was her turn to speak, she did not weep. She did not beg. Her voice, they said, was clear and calm. She answered each charge with logic and scorn. She pointed out the impossibility of the dates, the absurdity of the accusations. She spoke of her brother with horror at the thought of incest. She dismantled the lies as best she could. But it was useless. The peers were not there to judge. They were there to condemn. One by one, they rose and pronounced her guilty. The verdict was unanimous. The sentence was death, to be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's pleasure. When the sentence was read, Anne did not flinch. She raised her hand and said, "I am ready to die." It was a moment of such profound dignity that it shamed the men in the room. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, wept as he passed the sentence. Whether his tears were for her or for the family name she had dragged into the mud, history does not record. The king's pleasure was the sword. He communicated this through Cromwell, a small mercy that spared her the flames. It was also, perhaps, a final act of control. He would decide how she died. He would grant her a swift, clean death, and in doing so, claim a sliver of compassion. Anne received the news with relief, they say. Her neck was slender. It would be easy work for a skilled swordsman. She joked about it, a dark humor that was her only defense. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she is reported to have said, "and I have a little neck." She put her hands around it and laughed, the laughter of the condemned, the sound that echoes from the scaffold. The days between the trial and the execution were the hardest. She was returned to her rooms. The walls were the same. The sky through the small window was the same, but everything had changed. She was a corpse on leave, a ghost who still breathed. She gave away her possessions. She took the sacrament. She wrote her final prayer, a plea to God for mercy and for the king. She asked that he be blessed, that his reign be long and prosperous. It was the expected thing, the proper thing, but perhaps in that terrible solitude, it was also the true thing. She had loved him once. Perhaps in the end, she could not find it in her heart to curse him. She could only wait for the man with the sword. The 19th of May, 1536. The sky over London was pale, the sun a ghost behind thin clouds. Anne rose early. She received the sacrament one final time, swearing on the body of Christ that she was innocent. It was an oath she would carry to the next world. Her ladies helped her dress. The gown was simple grey damask with a fur trim at the cuffs. She wore a red petticoat beneath. Her hair was pinned up beneath a white linen coif. She was ready long before the appointed hour. The waiting was the worst part. As the morning light grew stronger, she was led from her rooms. The walk to the scaffold was short, but it must have felt like an eternity. The green was damp with dew. A small crowd had gathered, perhaps 1,000 people, a fraction of those who had watched her coronation. They were silent. Anne mounted the scaffold. She looked out at the crowd. Her face was pale, but her voice, when she spoke, did not waver. She did not protest her innocence, not directly. To do so would have been to question the king's justice, and that would have brought ruin upon her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke of accepting death, of praying for the king, of asking the people to pray for her soul. "I am come hither to die," she said, "for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." It was a masterpiece of forced diplomacy. She admitted no guilt. She simply submitted. She asked for the prayers of the faithful. She said goodbye. She knelt in the straw. Her ladies came forward and removed her headdress and collar. They tied a blindfold over her eyes. She knelt upright, her hands clasped in prayer. Her lips moved silently in the words of the final penitential psalms. The swordsman, hidden from her view, stepped forward. He had been brought from Calais for this single purpose. He was skilled. He would not miss. He drew his blade. The crowd held its breath. The only sound was Anne's whispered prayer. The sword was not swung like an axe. It was a single, swift, horizontal stroke. It was over in an instant. The head was severed. The lips continued to move in prayer for a moment after, a detail that would haunt the imaginations of all who saw it. The swordsman, according to custom, held up the head. There was no cry of "God save the king." There was only silence, a terrible, absolute silence. The guns of the tower fired to announce that the queen was dead, and in that sound, Anne Boleyn passed from the world of the living into the realm of legend. There was no royal coffin, no velvet pall, no procession to a great cathedral. Anne's body and her severed head were placed in an old elm arrow chest, a container meant for arrows, not for queens. It was too short. The body had to be crammed inside. She was buried in the floor of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. The chapel was small, intimate. The burial was hurried, without ceremony. No marker was placed. For generations, no one knew exactly where she lay. The woman who had been Queen of England was forgotten by the earth itself. But the earth, it seems, could not hold her. The stories began almost immediately. Within days of her death, it was said that a phantom coach, drawn by headless horses and driven by a headless coachman, raced through the countryside at night, carrying the ghost of the Queen. It was a folk tale, a way for a frightened people to process a shocking event. But other sightings were more personal. A lady in black was seen kneeling in the chapel where her bones lay. A white figure was glimpsed on the tower green where the scaffold had stood. A chill wind would pass through a room, and those who felt it knew somehow that she was near. The Tower of London became her primary haunt. Over the centuries, dozens of witnesses, soldiers, wardens, visitors have reported seeing her, a pale figure in a white dress, gliding near the Queen's house. A spectral procession moving through the chapel. A woman with dark hair looking out from a window in the room where she was imprisoned. Are these sightings real? The question is as old as ghost stories themselves. The rational mind dismisses them. The shadows in an ancient building play tricks. The power of suggestion, of knowing a tragic history, conjures phantoms from thin air. But the rational mind does not explain why so many see the same thing. It does not account for the chill that is more than cold. It does not answer for the deep, primal unease that settles on those who walk the tower's midnight corridors. The folklore of Anne Boleyn's ghost is not a lie. It is a testament. It is the people's way of saying that such a spirit, such a force, could not simply cease to be. She was too vivid, too intelligent, too alive to be contained by death. The ghost is not Anne. The ghost is the memory of Anne, imprinted on the stones, on the air, on the collective imagination of a nation. She haunts the tower because she was wronged there. She walks because we cannot forget her. When Anne died, her daughter Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. The little princess was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and removed from the line of succession. She was sent away from court to a house in the country with a small household and an uncertain future. She grew up in the shadow of her mother's death. She rarely spoke of Anne. It was too dangerous, too painful. Her father, the king, married again and again. He had his longed-for son, Edward, with Jane Seymour, who died shortly after the birth. Elizabeth watched from a distance as stepmothers came and went. She learned to be cautious. She learned to hide her thoughts. She learned to survive. But she was her mother's daughter. She had Anne's dark eyes, Anne's sharp intelligence, Anne's gift for languages, Anne's pride. The ghost of the mother lived on in the daughter, in every gesture, every word, every moment of defiance. Years passed, Henry died, Edward died, Mary, the Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, took the throne. It was a dangerous time for Elizabeth, the Protestant daughter of the woman Mary's mother had called the concubine. She was imprisoned in the Tower herself, walking the same green where her mother had died. She must have felt her presence there, in the cold stone, in the whisper of the wind. But Elizabeth survived, and when Mary died, she became queen. She was 25 years old. She rode through London on the day before her coronation, and the crowds, who had been silent for her mother, cheered for her. She was their queen. She was the hope of the nation. And in her face, they saw the ghost of Anne, the same dark eyes, the same proud bearing, the same intelligence that could cut a man down with a word. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years. She never married. She never had a child. She became the greatest monarch England had ever known, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana. She built a legend around herself, a myth of eternal youth and power, but at the core of that legend was a wound. She never spoke of her mother. She allowed no portraits of Anne to be displayed. She tried, in a sense, to erase her from the official record, but the echo could not be silenced. It was in her very being. Anne Boleyn had given England Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had given England an age of gold. So the next time you walk through the Tower of London, pause on the green. Feel the cold stone beneath your feet. Listen to the wind as it moves through the ancient walls. You are standing where a queen knelt, where a sword fell, where a life ended and a legend began. You are standing where the echo of Anne Boleyn is strongest. And if you listen closely, beyond the chatter of tourists, beyond the cries of the ravens, you might just hear it. A whisper, a sigh, the rustle of silk that has been dust for 5 centuries, the sound of a woman who refused to be forgotten. The ghost of Anne Boleyn does not haunt the tower. She haunts history itself, and as long as we remember, she will never truly die. Keep the candle lit.